The day Sue Radcliffe knocked on my door wearing that insufferable expression she reserves for people she believes are beneath her. I was standing in my garage watching a fresh 8 inches of snow bury my driveway, and mentally calculating how long it would take me to clear it before the temperature dropped another 10 degrees overnight. I had a bag of Arctic Shield premium ice melt sitting right next to the door, same as I did every winter, and I was honestly feeling pretty good about life. My driveway was clear, my walkway was salted, and I had a hot cup of coffee waiting on the kitchen counter. Then the doorbell rang, and whatever peace I had built up in the previous hour evaporated instantly. I opened the door and there she was. Sue Radcliffe, board treasurer and self-appointed aesthetics officer of Pinecrest Estates HOA, standing on my front porch in a puffy white coat that made her look like an oversized snow globe decoration, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. She had her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose and that tight little smile she pulls out whenever she thinks she has the upper hand. "Brian," she said, not even bothering with a hello, "I'm going to need to address something with you." I said sure, go ahead, already half dreading whatever was about to come out of her mouth. She looked down at her clipboard, adjusted her glasses, and said in that clipped, rehearsed tone she uses at board meetings, "The association has received a complaint regarding the ice melt product you've been spreading on your driveway and walkway. Specifically, the product in question is Arctic Shield Premium Ice Melt, which is not on the approved vendor and product list for Pinecrest Estates." She looked up at me with that practiced look of faux regret. "I'm going to need to issue you a formal warning." I blinked. I actually had to stop and make sure I'd heard that correctly. "An approved list," I said, "for ice melt. For all de-icing and snow-clearing materials, yes," she said, tilting the clipboard toward me so I could see she had printed out an actual document with bullet points and section headers. Section 14, subsection C, paragraph 2 of the Pinecrest Estates Community Standards and Maintenance Guidelines clearly states that any product applied to driveways, walkways, or common areas visible from the street must be an approved product listed in the Community Standards Addendum. I stood there for a moment just letting the wind blow a little snow sideways across my porch between us. "Sue," I said calmly, "it's 23 degrees outside and there are 8 inches of snow on the ground. I put down ice melt so my guests and my mail carrier don't fall and break something. That's it. That's the whole story." She smiled that thin, patient smile. "I understand that, Brian, but rules are rules. The warning will be filed in your HOA record, and if you continue to use an unapproved product, you may be subject to a fine of up to $250 per incident." She handed me a copy of the written warning right there on my porch, pivoted on the heel of her snow boot, and walked back down my front path toward the street, careful to step exactly in the footprints she'd made on the way in so as not to touch the salt I'd laid down. I watched her go, closed the door, and stood there for a long moment just holding the paper. Here's the thing about me that Sue Radcliffe did not know, and that would very shortly become the most satisfying piece of information in this entire situation. I'm not a guy who makes a scene. I'm not going to stand on someone's front lawn and yell about injustice. I sell commercial landscaping supplies and de-icing products for a living. My company, Walsh Supply Co., is a mid-sized distributor that covers a pretty wide territory across the state. We supply ice melt, sand, calcium chloride, and snow removal equipment to municipalities, commercial properties, landscaping crews, and yes, private neighborhood maintenance companies. I've been doing it for 12 years. I know every product on the market, every formulation, every price point. An Arctic Shield Premium Ice Melt, the exact product Sue Radcliffe had just written me up for. I supply it. I have a warehouse full of it. I sell it by the pallet to dozens of clients every winter, including, as it turned out, the very snow removal crew that Pinecrest Estates HOA hired every year to clear the common areas, the entrance road, the community parking areas, and the walking paths throughout the neighborhood. I didn't say anything to Sue that day. I just went back to my garage, finished my coffee, and let the situation settle in my mind like snow settling on a branch. Because I knew something she didn't, and I was absolutely going to let it ripen at its own pace. The snow that year was relentless. December had already dumped 3 separate storms on us, each one leaving 6 to 12 inches before the temperatures locked everything into a frozen crust that turned every flat surface into a skating rink by morning. The community was a mess for most of it, honestly. The HOA's contracted snow crew, a company called Whitecap Ground Services, was out at all hours trying to keep up with it. They had 3 trucks running plows and a crew of 4 guys who hand-shoveled walkways and spread de-icer on the community paths and the front entrance where the decorative brick pavers were. It was a big job, and they were working hard. I knew the owner of Whitecap Grounds personally. His name was Derek Moss, and we'd been doing business together for about 4 years. He was a solid guy who ran a tight operation, paid his invoices on time, and always placed his orders early in the season because he knew supply could get unpredictable during a bad winter. Every fall, Derek called me up and we'd go over his projected tonnage for the season, and I'd set aside inventory for him at a locked-in price. It was a good relationship. Mutual trust, no drama. That winter, Derek had ordered 12 pallets of Arctic Shield premium ice melt from me at the start of the season. 12 pallets. We're talking thousands of pounds of the exact same product that was sitting in a bag in my garage. The exact same brand, the exact same formula, the exact same green and white packaging with the big Arctic Shield logo printed across the front. The same stuff Sue Radcliffe had written me up for using on my own driveway. I didn't connect the dots out loud to anyone right away. I let the next few days go by, watched the snow crew work, watched Derek's guys haul bags of Arctic Shield out of their truck bed and spread it across the community paths right outside my window. Watched it go down on the entrance road and the parking area. Watched it get used on basically every surface in Pinecrest Estates except apparently the privately owned driveways of residents who had been written up by Sue for using it. And I just stored that knowledge away carefully like a document you know you're going to need someday. About a week after the warning, I got a letter in the mail from the HOA board formally confirming the written warning and reminding me that continued violation would result in fines. The letter was signed by Sue Radcliffe in her capacity as treasurer and co-enforcement officer, a title I was fairly certain she had invented for herself at some point in the last 2 years. The letter included a copy of the relevant section from the Community Standards and Maintenance Guidelines. I read it 3 times. It was real, it was actually in there. Some version of the product approval rule had been sitting in the bylaws for a while, likely written to prevent people from using straight rock salt that could damage the decorative pavers near the entrance, and somewhere along the way it had been quietly expanded during a board meeting that very few residents attended. I started doing some homework. I pulled up the HOA's approved product list, which was posted on their website, and was last updated approximately 8 months ago. There were about a dozen approved de-icing products on the list. Arctic Shield Premium Ice Melt was not one of them. I checked the meeting minutes from the board meeting where the expansion of the rule had been added. The meeting had 12 residents in attendance. Pinecrest Estates has 117 homes, so that was interesting. I also looked into what the HOA was paying Whitecap Ground Services each season. This was actually public information because it was part of the annual HOA budget, which was distributed to all homeowners every January. I still had last year's copy. The contract line for snow removal was just under $40,000 for the season. That was the full service contract. I knew what Derek charged for products separately because I was his supplier, and I knew he bought Arctic Shield from me. Now here's where things started to get a little more interesting. I'm a man who likes to understand the full picture before I make a move. So I called Derek up one afternoon, casually, like I was just checking in on his supply levels during the storm stretch, which was a legitimate reason to call. We talked about inventory. I confirmed his next delivery. And then I mentioned in a very offhand way that I'd heard the HOA at Pinecrest Estates was enforcing a product approval list for ice melt, and that Arctic Shield apparently wasn't on it. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Arctic Shield isn't on their approved list, Derek said. Apparently not. Another pause. Brian, I've been putting Arctic Shield on every square foot of that property all winter. I've been doing it for 3 years. I told him I was aware. He said he would look into his contract to see if there was any specification about which products to use. He called me back about an hour later and told me his service contract with Pinecrest Estates, HOA, mentioned only that all products used must meet environmental and safety standards and be appropriate for the surface types involved. There was no specific product approval list referenced in his contract, and no one at the HOA had ever told him not to use Arctic Shield. So Whitecap Grounds was under no obligation to use approved products according to their own contract, but individual homeowners were being written up and threatened with fines for using the exact same product that the HOA was paying $40,000 a year to have spread all over the common areas. I wrote that down. I also started paying closer attention to the HOA board in general. Sue Radcliffe had been on the board for 6 years and treasurer for 4. She was on the enforcement committee and the facilities committee and the communications committee. She was essentially 3/4 of the functional board because the 2 other active board members, a guy named Phil Grenell and a woman named Deborah Cho, tended to go along with whatever Sue said because they had learned that fighting her was more exhausting than agreeing with her. The 4th board position had been vacant for about a year because nobody wanted it. The thing about Sue, and I had been watching her long enough to understand this, was that she had a particular pattern. She targeted people, not randomly but strategically. She'd pick a homeowner, usually someone who had crossed her in some minor way or whose property she found objectionable for some reason, and she would pile on. She'd find violations, real or invented, and write them up one after another. She'd document everything in a way that made it look official and insurmountable, and the fines would accumulate until the person either gave in, hired a lawyer, or sold their house and moved. 3 families had left Pinecrest in the past 18 months. I didn't know all the details, but I'd heard enough to see the pattern. My neighbor across the street, a retired teacher named Gail Merritt, had been fighting Sue for 2 years over a rule about holiday decorations that Gail was fairly certain Sue had written specifically to target her. Gail put up a beautiful light display every December, and Sue had been trying to classify it as a commercial-scale visual disturbance. Since the year she'd seen Gail get a compliment about it from the property management company rep at a neighborhood meeting. It was pettiness operating at a very high altitude. There was also the situation with a young couple named Marco and Priya Akafer, who had moved in about 2 years ago and had almost immediately become a target for Sue. Marco had put up a small basketball hoop in his driveway, and Sue had written him up 4 separate times over it, citing rules about permanent structures even though the hoop was freestanding and movable. Marco had finally called an attorney, and the whole thing had eventually gone quiet, but they'd spent money doing it, and the stress had been real. So I wasn't just dealing with my own petty warning. I was looking at a pattern of behavior by someone who was using the HOA's enforcement mechanisms as a personal grievance instrument. And the ice melt situation was not the worst of it, but it was the one that was currently sitting in my lap, and it was the one where I happened to have the most devastating counterargument available. I let another week pass. The snow kept coming. The Whitecap crew was out twice more, each time spreading Arctic Shield ice melt on the community paths and entrance right in front of God and everyone. I took photos. Not in a sneaky way, just standing at my kitchen window with my phone, taking clear, dated, time-stamped photos of Derek's crew walking through the neighborhood with their spreaders, and their green and white Arctic Shield bags clearly visible. I also took a short video one morning when two of his guys were working right outside my front window. You could see the logo on the bag. You could see the product being applied to the community walkway. You could see the Whitecap Grounds truck in the background, with the company name clearly visible on the door. I organized everything into a folder on my computer. Photos of my warning letter. Photos of the approved product list from the HOA website. Photos of the relevant bylaw sections. Photos of Whitecap's crew using Arctic Shield on HOA-maintained property. A copy of last year's HOA budget showing the Whitecap contract amount. Notes from my call with Derek, including the date and a summary of what he'd told me about his contract. And I prepared one additional document that I thought would be particularly useful, which was a printed copy of the Walsh Supply Co. invoice for Derek's 12-pallet Arctic Shield order from the beginning of the season. My company name was on that invoice, my account number for the transaction, and the delivery address for Whitecap's facility. It was a clean, professional document that made it absolutely clear where Derek's supply was coming from and what he'd ordered. I'm the person who sells the ice melt. I supply it to the snow crew. The snow crew uses it all over this neighborhood. The HOA fined me for using the same product on my own property. The irony was almost artistic. Now, I want to be fair to myself here and say that for a brief window of time, I genuinely considered just handling this quietly. Call Sue, lay out the facts, give her a chance to rescind the warning and move on. No drama, no public embarrassment, just a private acknowledgement that the situation was a little absurd and a mutual agreement to forget it. That's how I would prefer to handle most things. I'm not a person who enjoys conflict. I run a business, I pay my HOA dues, I keep my property clean, I wave to my neighbors. I'm not looking for a fight. But then I got the second letter. This one arrived on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after the original warning. It was from the HOA board, same letterhead, signed again by Sue Radcliffe, and it informed me that I had been observed continuing to apply Arctic Shield ice melt to my driveway and walkway on at least 2 occasions since my initial written warning, that this constituted continued violation of Section 14, subsection C, paragraph 2, and that I was now being assessed a fine of $250 for each additional incident, totaling $500 currently owed to the Pinecrest Estates HOA, payable within 30 days. $500 for using ice melt that I personally supply to their own snow crew. I called Gail across the street that evening. We'd become friendly over the years, and I knew she'd been through enough HOA nonsense to have some useful perspective. I told her what was happening. She wasn't even surprised. She said Sue had pulled similar moves on at least 4 other homeowners she knew of in the past year alone, and that most of them had just paid because they didn't want the hassle. She asked me what I was planning to do. I told her I was going to the next board meeting, which was coming up in about 10 days, and I was going to bring my folder. Gail told me she was going to be there. Then she called Marco Acaffer and told him what was going on. Marco called 2 other neighbors, a couple named Ted and Linda Farris who had their own documented complaints about Sue, and a man named Carl Hutchinson who had been trying to challenge a rule Sue had enforced against his fence color for the better part of 8 months. By the end of the week, I knew that at least a dozen of my neighbors were planning to attend that board meeting, some of them carrying their own folders of grievances, all of them finally feeling like maybe there was enough momentum to push back collectively. The night before the meeting, I also did one additional thing. I called the HOA's property management company directly. Pinecrest Estates used a third-party management company called Meridian Property Services to handle the administrative side of things. They processed payments, maintained records, and were supposed to provide oversight of the board's decisions. I talked to our assigned account manager, a professional woman named Corinne Tillman who had always struck me as competent and sensible. I walked her through the situation. I explained that I'd been fined $500 for using a product that the HOA's own contracted snow removal company was using on community property. I told her I had documentation of all of it, including timestamped photos and my own supply invoices. I told her I thought there might be a selective enforcement problem and asked whether Meridian had a review process for disputed fines. Corinne Tillman was quiet for a moment and then said very carefully that she would pull the relevant files and have them ready before the board meeting. She also said, almost under her breath but clearly enough for me to hear, that this wasn't the first concern about selective enforcement she'd heard from Pinecrest Estates homeowners. The night of the board meeting was absolutely brutal outside. We'd gotten another 4 inches of fresh snow that afternoon, and the temperature had dropped to about 15 degrees by evening. The roads in the neighborhood were icy in spots where the Whitecap crew hadn't been through yet, and I actually watched 2 cars slide sideways at the stop sign near the entrance trying to leave for the meeting. I walked over since the community center was only 4 houses down, and I could see the parking lot already filling up as I crunched along the sidewalk in my boots. The community center meeting room was set up with about 30 folding chairs in rows facing a long table where the board sat. Phil Grenell and Deborah Cho were already at the table looking like people who had been called to the principal's office and weren't entirely sure what they'd done. Sue Radcliffe arrived about 3 minutes before the meeting was supposed to start, and she came in looking confident, almost amused, like she was used to board meetings being low-turnout affairs where she controlled the agenda and nothing interesting ever happened. She stopped when she saw the room. Every chair was filled. People were standing along the walls. I counted 37 neighbors in a room that usually held 12. Gail Merritt was in the front row with a thick manila envelope on her lap. Marco Acaffer was right behind her. Carl Hutchinson was standing near the back wall with his arms crossed. Ted and Linda Farris had brought their own printed materials. Corinne Tillman from Meridian Property Services was seated at a small table off to the side with a laptop open and a printer next to her. Sue sat down slowly at the board table, set her clipboard in front of her, and put on her reading glasses. She called the meeting to order in her usual authoritative voice, but it was about 15% quieter than normal. We got through the early agenda items, which were brief, and then Sue opened the floor for homeowner comments. She had a policy of giving each speaker 2 minutes, and she ran a timer on her phone. She thought this would keep things manageable. I went first because I'd signed up first. I walked up to the small podium they'd set up near the front of the room, set my folder down on it, and looked at the board for a moment without speaking. Then I laid it out clearly, calmly, and in detail. I told the board that I had received a written warning and then 2 fines totaling $500 for using Arctic Shield premium ice melt on my personal property. I described the relevant bylaw section as I understood it. Then I said that I had evidence that the very same product was being used routinely, extensively, and currently on all common areas of Pinecrest Estates by the HOA's contracted snow removal company, Whitecap Ground Services. I put my first photo on the projector that the community center had mounted to the ceiling above the board table. It was a clear image of a Whitecap Grounds crew member spreading product from a green and white Arctic Shield bag on the community walkway that ran along the east side of the neighborhood. You could read the brand name on the bag clearly. The photo was date and timestamped from about 11 days after my original warning. I heard a few people behind me make quiet sounds of surprise. I put up a second photo, closer angle, same bag, different day. Then the short video, which I played from my phone through the projector connection. You could hear the wind, you could see the snow on the ground, you could see the bag clear as anything in the worker's hands as he shook product into a wheeled spreader, and you could see the Whitecap Grounds logo on the truck door behind him. I put the video on pause and looked at the board. Phil Grenell was staring at the table. Deborah Cho was looking somewhere to the left of my face. Sue Radcliffe was looking directly at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. It was the look of someone who has just realized they've walked into a room they thought was empty and it is very much not empty. Then I put up the final document. The Walsh Supply Co. invoice for Derek Moss at Whitecap Ground Services. 12 pallets of Arctic Shield Premium Ice Melt. My company's name at the top. The current season order date, the delivery address, the product description. For context, I said, my name is Brian Walsh. Walsh Supply Co. is my business. I am the distributor who supplies Arctic Shield to the company you pay $40,000 a year to maintain this property. I have been using this product safely and responsibly on my own driveway for 3 winters. And I have been fined $500 for it while the same product is applied by your own vendor to every walkway and road in this community. The room was silent for a moment, and then it was not silent at all. There was a general murmur that rose up behind me, and I let it run for a few seconds before I wrapped up. I said I expected my fine to be rescinded, the warning to be removed from my record, and the relevant bylaw section to be reviewed for consistent and fair application. Then I said thank you and picked up my folder. Sue found her voice somewhere while I was walking back to my seat. She said in a controlled tone that the situation with the contracted vendor was something the board would need to review separately, and that individual homeowner violations were a different matter from vendor compliance issues. That's when Karen Tillman from Meridian spoke up from her side table. She said calmly that actually, from an administrative standpoint, selective enforcement of community rules was a significant liability issue, and that if a product was being used by an HOA-sanctioned vendor on community property, it was extremely difficult to sustain a violation against a homeowner for using the same product on their own property. She said she'd prepared a brief memo on the subject that she'd like to share with the board, and she handed printed copies to Phil and Deborah, who both read them with the kind of focused attention that people use when they are very grateful to have something to look at besides the person who is about to have a bad night. Sue said she didn't think this was the appropriate time for the management company to be offering legal opinions. Karen said it wasn't a legal opinion, it was an administrative observation, and that Meridian's responsibility to the HOA included flagging potential liability issues before they became legal claims. Then Gail Merritt stood up from the front row without waiting for the podium and said that, while we were on the subject of selective enforcement, she had 22 months of documentation regarding a holiday decoration dispute that she would very much like to put before the board. And then Marco Acaffer stood up and said he had his own file, and Carl Hutchinson said he had his, and Ted Farris said Linda and he had been compiling their notes for 6 months. What followed was about 90 minutes that I will describe simply as productive. One by one, neighbors who had been handled badly by the HOA enforcement process laid out their cases. The pattern that I had observed privately was now visible to everyone in the room, documented across multiple households, spanning years. Sue presided over all of it with decreasing composure and increasing anger, but the anger didn't help her because the facts were the facts, and they were in writing with dates on them. Phil Grenell, who I think had been uncomfortable with a lot of this for longer than he'd admitted to anyone, started asking pointed questions during some of the presentations. He asked Sue directly, during Gail's portion, whether the board had documentation showing that any other homeowners had received warnings for holiday decorations in the past 3 years. Sue said that was a matter of board record and not appropriate for open discussion. Phil said the board records were public and he would like to see them before the next meeting. Deborah Cho seconded that request, which meant it was a majority board motion, and Sue had to acknowledge it. By the time the meeting was wrapping up, 3 things had been agreed to by the board, 2 of them over Sue's objection. 1. Brian Walsh's fines would be suspended pending an administrative review to be completed within 30 days. 2. The Pinecrest Estates product approval list would be cross-referenced against all products currently in use by HOA contracted vendors, and any inconsistencies would be addressed before any new violations were issued. 3. Meridian Property Services would conduct a review of all HOA enforcement actions from the past 24 months and report back to the full board and the community. Sue sat very still through all 3 votes. She had her pen in her hand, and she was writing something on her notepad the whole time, but her face was doing things that suggested the writing wasn't helping very much. After the meeting broke up, people stood around in the community center for a while just talking. There was this feeling in the room that I recognized from situations where something that had been building for a long time finally surfaces. Relief mixed with energy. People who had been dealing with things quietly and alone, realizing they weren't alone at all. Gail introduced herself to Marco, and they spent 15 minutes comparing timelines. Carl and Ted discovered they'd received letters from Sue written in the same week with almost identical wording, which they found worth noting. I talked to Phil Grinnell briefly on his way out. He was bundled up for the cold and he looked tired, but something in his expression was lighter than it had been at the table. He said quietly that he thought some of what had been raised was warranted and that he appreciated people showing up. I thanked him and meant it. I walked home in the cold, listened to my boots crunch on the salted walkway, and felt pretty satisfied. Not in a triumphant way, more in the way you feel after something that needed to happen finally happens. The review process that Meridian kicked off turned out to be more consequential than I'd expected. Corinne Tillman was thorough. Over the following 3 weeks, she went through every enforcement action, every fine, every warning letter, every notice that had been issued by the Pinecrest Estates HOA in the past 24 months. She cross-referenced them against the documented bylaw violations, the homeowner responses, the board meeting minutes, and the financial records. What she found was not just selective enforcement. It was something considerably worse. Corinne called me one morning while I was at my office reviewing winter supply orders and told me that she had found several instances where fines had been assessed and collected from homeowners for violations that, on review, did not appear to actually violate any existing bylaw. She said she'd also found what looked like discrepancies in the HOA's financial records related to fine payments. Some payments that were documented as received in the homeowner's correspondence files did not appear in the HOA's general account. The amounts were not enormous, but they were consistent enough across multiple transactions to be significant. She said she was obligated to escalate the issue to the HOA's legal counsel, and that depending on what the review found, the appropriate next step might be a referral to the State Attorney General's Office for Nonprofit Financial Misconduct. I'll be honest, I had not expected it to go that far. I'd been prepared for a bureaucratic skirmish, maybe a drawn-out argument over rule interpretations. I was not prepared for the possibility that there was actual financial misconduct involved. The next few days moved fast. The HOA's attorney, a man named Gary Weston who had been the board's retained counsel for years, reviewed the discrepancies Corinne identified and confirmed that they needed to be formally investigated. He notified the board members individually. Phil and Deborah both contacted Meridian separately to cooperate with the review. Sue stopped returning calls to the management company and then to Gary Weston. 2 weeks after the board meeting, 2 things happened in the same day. The Meridian review concluded that a total of approximately $9,000 in collected HOA fines over a 20-month period could not be accounted for in the association's financial records. And a local detective from the Financial Crimes Unit left a business card in Sue Radcliffe's door because she wasn't home when he knocked. She was home the second time he came by. I heard about the interview from Phil, who was cooperating fully with everything at that point. He told me it was not a comfortable conversation for Sue. The detective had a copy of the discrepancy analysis and specific questions about cash equivalent fine payments that had been processed outside the normal bank deposit process. Sue had apparently been collecting some fine payments as money orders or personal checks made out in ways that allowed them to be deposited into a personal account rather than the HOA's operating account. It was not an enormous amount of money, but it was a clear pattern over a sustained period of time. She wasn't arrested at her front door in handcuffs, but within 3 weeks of that interview, Sue Radcliffe was formally charged with misappropriation of nonprofit funds and breach of fiduciary duty, which are serious offenses. She resigned from the HOA board the same day the charges were filed, which surprised nobody. Her attorney issued a statement saying she intended to cooperate with the investigation and that the situation was more complicated than the charges suggested, which is something attorneys say when they are not sure what else to say. The criminal case moved through the system over the following months. I won't say it was fast because courts don't move fast, but it moved. She eventually entered a guilty plea to a reduced charge of misappropriation, paid back the full $9,000 plus penalties and legal costs, received a formal criminal record, and was permanently barred from serving on any nonprofit board in the state. In the immediate aftermath of everything, the HOA had to sort itself out significantly. Phil Grinnell stepped up as temporary board president while a proper election was organized. Deborah Cho stayed on and was actually quite effective once she wasn't being steamrolled. The vacant board seat was filled by Marco Acaffer, who turned out to be exactly the kind of organized, clear-thinking person you want on a governance body. Carl Hutchinson ran for the 5th seat and won it. Gail Merritt declined a seat because she said she'd rather be free to yell from the audience, which honestly was also valuable. The product approval list was revised. It now simply requires that any de-icing product used on private property be certified as safe for use on the surface types present and compliant with local environmental regulations. Arctic Shield Premium Ice Melt, along with about 40 other common products, meets those standards easily. The rule about holiday decorations was rewritten to set actual objective standards around lighting levels rather than giving any individual board member discretion to classify displays as disturbances. The basketball hoop rule was amended to clearly distinguish between permanent and freestanding structures. A lot of things that had been weaponized got defanged. All of the fines that Meridian had flagged as questionable, the ones where the violations were either non-existent or the payment records were unclear, were reviewed one by one and either refunded or credited to homeowner accounts. My $500 fine was among the first to go. I also got a formal written notice removing the warning from my HOA record, which was signed by Phil Grinnell and dated within 30 days of the board meeting exactly as agreed. Derek Moss at Whitecap Grounds was never in any trouble over any of this. He hadn't done anything wrong. His contract didn't specify products beyond safety standards, and Arctic Shield was a legitimate, well-tested product that he'd been using industry-wide for years. He actually called me after some of the news got around and said he'd heard the whole story and that he found it pretty remarkable. I told him the remarkable part was that Sue Radcliffe apparently never looked at who the HOA was buying their snow removal from. He laughed and said maybe she should have. I told him his spring planting supply order was going to be ready whenever he needed it. About 2 months after the board meeting, on a Saturday morning in late February, the neighborhood got hit with the last big storm of the season. 14 inches, which is the kind of thing that shuts everything down for a day and then becomes a beautiful inconvenience once the plows come through. I was out in my driveway by 7 in the morning with my shovel and my spreader. I had a fresh bag of Arctic Shield sitting open next to the garage door. The air was still and cold, and the snow was the dry, light kind that's actually pretty satisfying to move. Gail came out around the same time across the street, and we waved to each other. Marco and Priya were clearing their front walk. Carl was working on his driveway 2 houses down. There was a whole neighborhood rhythm to it. people out in their coats and boots handling the weather together in that way that winter forces on communities whether they like it or not. The white-capped truck came through around 9, running the plow along the community road and sending a good wave of snow across the already cleared ends of everyone's driveways, which is the eternal compromise of living somewhere that gets plowed. Derek's guys came through on foot with their spreaders a little later, working the walking paths and the entrance area, bags of Arctic Shield in the spreader hoppers, same as always. I stood there for a minute just watching the whole scene. The neighborhood looked good. The snow was getting cleared, the paths were being treated, the houses were solid and warm behind their windows. It was just a normal winter Saturday in a neighborhood that was, for the first time in a while, actually being governed like it was supposed to be governed, with rules that applied to everyone the same way and a board that was answering to the community instead of dictating to it. I finished spreading my driveway, folded the empty Arctic Shield bag, and tossed it in the recycling bin. Went inside, made another coffee, and sat by the window watching the snow settle into that beautiful quiet that follows a storm when everything is white and still, and the worst of it is over. I also, for what it's worth, filed my own business contact information with the new HOA board as a potential preferred vendor for de-icing supplies. Phil thought it was an interesting idea. He said he'd bring it up at the next meeting. I told him there was no rush, but that if the board was ever interested in a neighborhood bulk rate on winter supplies, Walsh Supply Co. was absolutely happy to have that conversation. That conversation happened in March. The new board voted to establish a voluntary community group purchasing program for winter supplies, where any homeowner could opt in to order through a community bulk account at a negotiated rate. I worked out a sensible deal for Pinecrest Estates that saved participating households a meaningful amount on their annual de-icing costs. About 60% of the neighborhood signed up in the first year. I genuinely could not have written a better ending to the whole situation if I'd tried. There's a thing that happens sometimes when one person in a community has been making everyone smaller for long enough that people start forgetting they don't have to be small. That meeting in February was the moment Pinecrest Estates stopped being small. Gail didn't have to fight a petty decoration battle alone anymore. Marco didn't have to pay a lawyer to defend his kid's basketball hoop. Carl got his fence color approved. Ted and Linda finally got a straight answer about the landscaping complaint that had been hanging over them for months. And I got my $500 back, eventually, from the escrow that Meridian set up from the recovered misappropriated funds. Sue Radcliffe did not go to prison. I want to be clear about that because it might sound from the description of the charges like she should have, but the system evaluated the specifics and landed where it landed. She got a criminal record, lost her position, lost her reputation in this community, paid back everything she took, and will never be allowed to sit on a nonprofit board again. Whether that's the right outcome is above my pay grade to assess. What I know is that the people she hurt got at least partial accountability, the community got its money back, and the mechanisms she abused got reformed. She also sold her house and moved that spring, which I won't pretend wasn't a relief. Not because I wanted her gone specifically, but because the dynamic she had created in the neighborhood genuinely required her absence in order to fully reset. The new owners of her property are a young family with 2 kids and a large, enthusiastic dog who is very friendly and has no opinions about ice melt brands. They moved in during the first warm week of April and immediately introduced themselves to everyone on the street. The dog's name is Walter. He's a large yellow lab who has already eaten one of Gail's garden gloves and a corner of Marco's welcome mat, and everyone is delighted by him. Walter's owners, the Peterson family, are also already signed up for the Community Bulk Winter Supply Program for next season. Their first order is scheduled for delivery before Thanksgiving. I know because I'm their distributor, and if anyone from the HOA Enforcement Committee wants to come by and inspect the product, they are welcome to. I've got the invoice right here. The winter that should have been just another ordinary season of snow clearing and heating bills, and road salt turned into something I genuinely did not expect. Not because I went looking for a fight, but because sometimes a situation lines itself up in such a perfectly ridiculous way that the truth becomes impossible to ignore, and the right people in the right positions decide to actually do something about it. I've been in the supply business long enough to know that products don't have reputations, people do. Arctic Shield ice melt is the same formula it's always been. It melts ice effectively. It's safe on most surfaces when applied correctly, and it works in temperatures down to about -25, which is more than adequate for what we deal with around here. It doesn't know or care whether it's being spread on a community walking path by a professional grounds crew or on a residential driveway by a homeowner in his work boots on a Tuesday morning. It just does what it's designed to do. What gave it a reputation in Pinecrest Estates was one person with a clipboard and a personal agenda, deciding that the same product was acceptable when she was in control of who used it, and unacceptable when a homeowner she wanted to target pulled a bag out of a garage. And the reason that logic fell apart is because I happened to be the one she picked, and I happened to be the guy who supplies the bags. There's a version of this story where I get fined, I grumble about it, I pay it, and life goes on. That version exists. I've watched it happen to other people in this neighborhood for years. The fine isn't the unbearable part. The fine is just money. The unbearable part is the implication underneath it, which is that the rules apply differently to different people, and there's nothing you can do about it, and you should just accept that and be quiet. I'm not good at being quiet when I have a folder full of evidence and a reasonable expectation that the adults in the room will look at it honestly. As it turns out, enough of them did. The spring after everything resolved, the HOA organized its first proper community event in 4 years. A neighborhood spring cleanup day where people could come out and tackle the common areas together, plant some flowers in the entrance bed, fix a few things that had been deferred too long. Phil organized it, Marco helped with logistics, Gail brought homemade pastries and set up a folding table next to the community center door. About 40 people showed up, which is nearly a third of the neighborhood, and the entrance planting beds ended up looking genuinely beautiful. I brought a box of donuts and spent most of the morning pulling dead brush out of the east fence line and chatting with neighbors I'd been too busy or too wary to really connect with in the years before. Ted Farris turned out to be an absolutely hilarious storyteller. Priya Akafer knew more about soil composition and cold season planting than anyone I'd ever met. Carl Hutchinson, who had seemed kind of intimidating in the meeting room, turned out to be a deeply gentle man who spent most of the cleanup making sure elderly neighbors had water and weren't overexerting themselves in the spring sun. It was a good day. The kind of good day that Pinecrest Estates hadn't had in a while, and that I think was always possible if the weight of one person's petty authority hadn't been sitting on it. I drove home from the hardware store that afternoon with a new bag of ice melt in my trunk. Off-season purchase, good price, stocking up before demand drives prices up in fall. It was Arctic Shield, because it's what I know works and what I stock in bulk and what I've always used. I put it in the garage next to the snow shovel and the spare windshield scraper, and the little toolkit for the furnace filter, all the winter preparedness stuff that any sensible homeowner keeps within reach when they live somewhere with real winters. I looked at the bag for a second before I went inside. Green and white packaging, big bold Arctic Shield logo, the familiar product description on the back listing specs and application rates. Same bag as always. Same product that had been spreading itself across this drama for the past several months in one way or another. I left it there, went inside, poured myself a glass of water, and looked out the kitchen window at the quiet spring street. Green coming back into the lawns, kids on bikes, Walter the lab bounding across someone's yard in that unstoppable way large dogs have when the ground is finally soft enough to run on without slipping. It was a good neighborhood. It had always been a good neighborhood. It just needed one season to get the weight off its chest and remember that. Next winter is already in the weather forecasts in a general sense. The kind of long-range predictions that say the season will be colder than average and above average snowfall is expected in our region. I've already talked to Derek about his Arctic Shield order. He's going up from 12 pallets to 15 because the forecasts have him and his commercial clients nervous about supply. I've got them reserved at his agreed price. The Pinecrest Estates community bulk account is also already pre-reserved for 100 bags through next October, which will be distributed to participating households at cost plus a minimal handling fee. That order is confirmed and on the books. No drama, no clipboard, no subsection C paragraph 2. Just people who live in the same community taking care of it together, the way it was supposed to work all along. And somewhere in all of that, without really planning it that way, I became the ice melt guy for my own neighborhood, which is funny in a quiet kind of way that I think I'll keep to myself most of the time, except on the occasions when someone new to the community asks me what the deal is with ice melt and why the HOA seems to care about it. On those occasions, I tell them the story. Not the whole thing usually, but enough of it. I tell them about the warning and about what I do for a living and about the Whitecap crew and about the meeting. I tell them it got sorted out. And I tell them that if they ever need ice melt at a good price, Walsh Supply Co. is right there in the business directory, and I'm very easy to reach. Every single time I tell it, whoever's listening laughs at the part where Sue wrote up the guy who supplies the product to the snow crew. Every time. And I laugh too, because it genuinely is funny in that specific way that things are funny when they are both absurd and completely true. The first snow of next season will come when it comes. The temperature will drop. The sky will go that particular gray that means serious business. And at some point the first flakes will hit the driveway and the whole routine will start again. I'll have my boots ready and my shovel by the garage door and my bag of Arctic Shield standing by. The Whitecap truck will come through with its plow, same as always. The community paths will get treated, same as always. And nobody in Pinecrest Estates will say a word about what brand of ice melt anyone is using, because the rules now say what they mean and mean what they say and apply to everyone the same way. That's all any of us ever wanted. A neighborhood that works like a neighborhood, governed by people who actually represent the community instead of themselves. It's not a complicated thing. It's just sometimes harder to hold on to than it should be. But we've got it now. And this winter, we've got the ice melt situation sorted too.